A man opened an old Singer sewing machine drawer and his hands started shaking. What he found inside would not let him be for weeks. Not when he was eating, not when he was driving, not when he lay awake at 3 in the morning, listening to the November wind push against the windows of his house on Cane Branch Road. Vernon Tackett had been hauling junk for going on 30 years. He was 60 years old, wide through the shoulders, with hands that showed the work. Scarred across the knuckles, a crooked left ring finger he broke on a cast-iron stove back in '91 and never had properly set. He drove a 1992 Chevy pickup, dark blue where the paint held on, gray primer where it didn't, with a wooden bed he'd built himself from oak planks. He carried a case of 30 weight under the seat and didn't complain about it. That Saturday morning he was up before 6. His wife, Darlene, was still asleep. He put on the coffee pot, the old aluminum percolator she'd threatened to replace for 15 years, and stood at the kitchen window while it ran. The field behind the house was white with frost. A doe stood at the far tree line, tail up, testing the air. Vernon watched her until the percolator started its noise and she walked back into the woods. He poured a cup and drank it at the table, looking at the list he'd scratched out on the back of an envelope. The demolition contractor, a man named Buddy Kraft out of Grayson, had called him Thursday. House up in Pruitt Hollow, end of a dirt road, condemned 6 months back, foundation cracked, porch collapsed, roof starting to bow. Bulldozer was coming Monday. Whatever furniture was inside, Vernon could have it. That was how the second-hand business worked in Carter County. You knew the contractors, the estate lawyers, the 2 auction houses within driving distance. When something came loose, you were there first. He sold goods at a flea market in Grayson on Fridays and Saturdays, a stall near the back door where the light came in good. He knew what things were worth. A walnut dresser with original brass pulls, a kerosene lamp with an intact chimney, pressed glass canning jars, the old kind. He topped off his coffee and left before Darlene woke up. She knew where he went on Saturday mornings. The drive up Pruitt Hollow took 20 minutes. The paved road gave way to gravel after the first creek crossing, then to packed dirt climbing steeply between bare oaks and hickories. Tygart Creek ran along the left side of the road, shallow over limestone. The air coming through the wing vent smelled of cold mud and dead leaves and wood smoke from somewhere up the hollow. The house sat at the end of the road where the dirt gave out. It had been a decent house once. 2 stories, white clapboard, a porch that wrapped around the front and east side. Now the porch had caved in on the east end, the roof over it sagging, half the upstairs windows broken. Someone had nailed a condemned notice from the county to the front door. He'd seen 100 like it, houses that outlived the people who cared about them. The county was full of them, old company houses and boarding houses from the days when men came to these hollows for work and sometimes never found their way out. You couldn't feel sorry for every one. You'd never stop. He killed the engine, got his gloves, and went in. The inside was cold as a well, colder than the air outside, the kind of cold that clings to stone foundations and old plaster. He went through the rooms methodically, the way he always worked. Living room first, then the kitchen, then back through the 2 downstairs bedrooms. He found a walnut dresser in the first bedroom with 3 of its 4 knobs intact and dovetail joints that still held tight. That was worth something. He found a set of 12 pressed glass canning jars on the shelf in the kitchen, dusty but uncracked. A kerosene lamp on the mantel with the chimney hole. An oak side chair with a woven cane seat, only 3 strands broken. He set these things in the front room near the door. He worked slowly, which was also how he always worked. Rushing got you nothing except missed items and a pulled back. The back bedroom was smaller, the ceiling stained dark from water, the wallpaper peeling in long strips. A metal bed frame leaned against one wall. A cardboard box of old magazines sat in the corner, too far gone to save. And against the far wall, under the window, sat the Singer. It was a cabinet model, 1940s by the look of it. The black and gold treadle machine set into a walnut cabinet with the cast-iron base underneath. The wood was dusty but solid. Vernon tilted the cabinet to test the weight. heavy, which was good, and heard something shift in the drawer below the machine bed. He set it down. He pulled the drawer open. Inside was a stack of papers, as thick as a church hymnal, held together with a rubber band so old it crumbled when his fingers touched it. The papers fanned apart on the cabinet surface, then slid off onto the floor. Vernon went to one knee and picked them up. He carried them to the window where the gray light came through and held the first one up. Power of attorney. The words were printed at the top of the form in old-fashioned typescript. Below them, the name of the person granting authority, Emmett Ray Prater. The name of the person receiving authority, Lorena May Skaggs. Vernon looked at the rest of the stack. More power of attorney forms. He counted 6 in all, each with a different name on the granting line and the same name on the receiving line. Below the legal forms were endorsed pension checks, Veterans Administration checks, and Social Security checks. The endorsements on the backs written in a consistent, careful hand. Death certificates, 6 of them, each with the same 2 words typed in the family section, no next of kin. And at the bottom of the stack, below all of it, wrapped in a piece of gray flannel that had once been part of a work shirt, was a Purple Heart medal. The silk ribbon was faded from purple to a pale lavender. The medal itself was clean. Vernon closed the drawer and stood there with the stack of papers in his hands. He opened the drawer again. It did not help. He sat on the edge of the iron bed frame and read the first power of attorney form again, slowly. Emmett Ray Prater. He knew that name. Everybody in Carter County knew the Praters. Lottie Prater still went to the Church of Christ in Hitchens. She'd bought a pie plate from Vernon's stall at the flea market not 3 weeks ago. Told him her Uncle Emmett had come back from the Pacific and never got straight. Drank away his pension, the family always said. Died with nothing. Vernon put the papers down on his thigh and stared at the water stain on the wallpaper for a while. Then he wrapped the Purple Heart back in its flannel, put it with the papers, and put all of it back in the drawer. He carried the Singer cabinet to his truck, 2 trips, the cabinet first, then the cast iron base. Loaded it in beside the dresser and the canning jars, and drove back down the hollow without stopping. He did not turn on the radio. He drove with both hands on the wheel, watching the bare trees go past, and thinking about what a stack of old papers could mean to a woman who had spent 60 years believing a lie. Vernon spread the documents across his kitchen table Sunday morning after Darlene went to church. He used the good table, the one she kept a cloth on, and he moved the cloth first and folded it and set it on the counter. Then he spread the papers out the way he sorted stock at the flea market, by category, by date, working from the oldest to the newest. The picture that came together was precise and ugly. 6 men, all elderly, all either veterans drawing benefits or men old enough to collect Social Security. All of them had passed through the same boarding house in Carter County between 1954 and 1968, a 14-year stretch. Each had signed a power of attorney granting full legal control of his finances to one Lorena May Skaggs. Each man's checks, Veterans Administration benefit checks, Social Security retirement checks, had been endorsed on the back in the same careful, somewhat formal handwriting. Each man had died. Each death certificate listed no next of kin. Vernon went through the names in order. Emmett Ray Prater, who'd served in the Pacific. Thomas Aldridge Goines. Walter Henry Hensley. Cecil Monroe Booth. Robert James Dillon. August Franklin Sloan. 6 men, 6 sets of documents, 6 death certificates with the same typed notation where the family section should have been filled in. The composition notebook was the last thing he read, and it was the worst. It was a small notebook, the kind schoolchildren used, black and white marbled cover, about 60 pages. The handwriting inside matched the endorsements on the checks. Careful, unhurried, the letters well-formed. Each page covered one man. At the top of each page, a name. Below that, a date range. Below that, columns. Month, dollar amount received, dollar amount in household expenses, net gain. Lorena Skaggs had kept a ledger of what she made from each boarder, tracked to the penny, with a running total at the bottom of each page. Emmett Ray Prater's page ran from January of '57 to November of '63. His Veterans Administration benefit, $47 per month. Monthly household expense allocation for his room and meals, $12. Net gain to Lorena Skaggs per month, $35. At the bottom of the page, in the same careful hand, a note, house and 2 acres, Stinson Branch. Transferred November '63. Vernon sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He got up and poured a fresh cup of coffee, the percolator still warm on the stove. He stood at the window. The frost had burned off by now, and the field behind the house was brown and flat in the November light. He thought about Emmett Prater lying in a boarding house in Carter County while somebody deposited his pension check and kept $12 worth of expenses and pocketed the rest. He thought about that for a while. Then he went back to the table and kept reading. Monday morning, he drove to the Carter County Courthouse in Grayson. The property records office was on the 2nd floor, the door half glass, the name lettered in gold paint. The woman behind the counter was named Paulette. She had a name tag and a habit of clicking her ballpoint pen when she was thinking, and she pulled the deed records for Emmett Ray Prater and 3 of the other names from the notebook without much trouble. Emmett Prater had owned 2 acres on Stinson Branch with a small frame house. In November of 1963, the month of his death according to the death certificate in the Singer drawer, ownership of those 2 acres had transferred to Lorena May Skaggs. The deed of transfer was on file. It was signed by Emmett Prater. Vernon asked Paulette to pull up the other names. Walter Hensley had owned a small piece of ground on Little Fork Creek. Transferred to Lorena Skaggs in '65. Cecil Booth had a lot in Olive Hill with a small structure. Transferred to Skaggs in '67. Robert Dillon had owned 40 acres up near the Elliott County line. A real piece of ground, the best thing in the bunch. Transferred to Skaggs in '68. Paulette looked at the screen, then at Vernon, then back at the screen. She clicked her pen 3 times. "You doing research?" she said. "Something like that," Vernon said. He thanked her and went back to his truck. He sat in the courthouse parking lot with the engine off and the November wind rocking the cab slightly. He thought about Lottie Prater. She was 74 years old, lived over in Hitchens by herself since her husband Harold passed 5 years back. She had a vegetable garden and a good clothesline, and she went to church every week, and she had spent her entire life believing that her Uncle Emmett drank away his pension and died a pauper. She had been told that. The family had been told that. The death certificate said no next of kin, so nobody came. Nobody asked questions. The land transferred, the pension money was gone, and Emmett Prater went into the ground with nothing. And the family buried their grief and called it his own fault. Vernon drove to the gas station on 3rd Street and used the payphone there. He called his cousin Harold, different Harold, his mother's sister's son, who worked in the clerk's office up in Ashland. Harold wasn't in, so Vernon left a message with the woman who answered, that he needed to talk to somebody who knew property law and didn't owe any favors to the Carter County establishment. Then he drove home and sat on the front porch with a second cup of coffee and looked at the barn and thought about what it meant to steal from a man who had no one to protect him. He thought about it for a long time. That evening, Darlene came in from church and put supper on, and they ate without much talking, which was not unusual. She asked how the salvage trip went. He said, "Fine, got a singer, ought to be worth something." She said, "That was good." He said, "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for a while. After supper, he went back to the table and looked at the documents again. He counted the pension checks, 46 of them for Emmett Prater alone, each one endorsed in Lorena Skaggs's hand, each one deposited into her account. $47 a month for 79 months. That was about $3,700 just from one man. Across all 6 men, across 14 years, the take was somewhere around $30,000. And that was before you counted the land. $30,000 in 1968 money. Vernon closed the notebook. The rubber band was gone. He'd snapped it opening the drawer. so he used a piece of kitchen twine to keep the papers in their stack. He put the stack in the drawer of the Singer, which sat against the living room wall where he'd put it Saturday night. He looked at the machine for a moment. The black lacquer finish was still good. The gold scrollwork on the machine head was intact. It was a beautiful piece of work, even after 60 years. He turned off the light and went to bed. He lay there for an hour before he slept, listening to the wind, thinking about 6 names on 6 death certificates, and the woman whose handwriting matched all the endorsements on all the checks. Vernon drove to Hitchens on a Wednesday evening, after supper, when the light was going out of the sky and the temperature had dropped back to where November belonged. He took the Singer documents with him in a manila envelope he'd gotten from the dollar store in Grayson. All the papers, the notebook, the death certificates. He left the Purple Heart in the drawer at home. He wasn't ready for that part yet. Lottie Prater lived in a small frame house on a side street 2 blocks off the main road. The white paint was fresh. She'd had it done in the spring. You could still see the clean lines where the painter's tape had been. A vegetable garden ran along the south side of the house, the beds bare now, tomato cages stacked against the fence. A clothesline stretched between 2 metal posts. A single light burned in the kitchen window. Vernon knocked and heard her move inside. She came to the door in an apron, a dish towel over one shoulder, the kind of woman who was always in the middle of something. She was thin, with arthritic hands that had a permanent slight curl to the fingers. Her hair was white and cut short. She wore glasses with wire frames that had been bent slightly out of shape on the left side, giving her a slightly tilted look when she looked at you straight on. "Vernon Tackett," she said. Not a question. She knew him from the flea market, from church potlucks, from the general geography of Carter County. "Evening, Lottie. Mind if I come in a minute?" She looked at the envelope under his arm. "I guess not," she said, and stepped back. The kitchen was warm from the stove, which was an old propane range, one of the burners going under a pot of something that smelled like beans. A calendar on the wall showed November. A framed photograph of a man in a suit stood on the windowsill. Harold, Vernon figured, Lottie's husband gone 5 years. A small radio on the counter played a country station, low. Lottie turned the burner down and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table. She sat with her hands folded. She was not the kind of woman who offered coffee to someone she wasn't expecting. Vernon sat across from her. He put the envelope on the table between them. "I need to ask you about your Uncle Emmett," he said. She didn't stiffen, exactly, but something in her face settled. The way a person goes still when a subject comes up that they've thought about before, alone, and haven't talked about in a long time. "What about him?" she said. Vernon asked her to tell him what the family knew. She told it plainly, the way people tell old family stories, worn smooth by years of telling it to themselves. Emmett came home from the Pacific in '45 and was never quite right. He drifted for 10 years, couldn't hold a job, couldn't stay in one place. In '57, he ended up at a boarding house in Carter County, run by a woman named Miss Skaggs. The family knew where he was. They sent letters. He wrote back sometimes, not often. When he died in November of '63, a man from the county came to the house to tell the family. He said Emmett had left nothing, no savings, no property, no possessions to speak of. They buried him in the county cemetery. "Mama always said the war took everything from him," Lottie said, "even his sense. She said there wasn't anything wrong with him that the Pacific didn't put there." She looked at her hands. I believed her. Vernon opened the manila envelope. He took out the power of attorney form with Emmett's name on it. He placed it on the table in front of her. She looked at it for a moment before she picked it up. She read the whole thing, slowly, her lips moving slightly on the formal language. Then she set it down. Vernon put the ledger page on top of it. Emmett's page from the composition notebook, with the monthly totals and the note at the bottom about the house and 2 acres on Stinson Branch. Then the death certificate. He tapped the family section with one finger. She leaned close. No next of kin. Lottie took her glasses off and cleaned them on her apron. She put them back on and looked at the death certificate again. "She stole from him," Lottie said. It was not a question. It was not a verdict. It was just the plain statement of what she was looking at. Vernon said yes. He pulled out the last thing in the envelope, a certified copy of the property transfer record. Emmett Prater's 2 acres on Stinson Branch passing to Lorena Skaggs in November of '63, the same month as the death certificate. Lottie held it, and her hands were steady, but her face had gone the color of old ash. "He had 2 acres, she said. "He had 2 acres and a house," Vernon said, "and she took both." Lottie set the papers down. She was quiet for what felt like 3 minutes. The beans simmered on the stove. The radio played something slow. "Is that woman still alive?" Lottie asked. "She is, 81, lives in a big house over in Olive Hill." Something went hard in Lottie's face. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than anger. "Then what are we going to do about it?" Vernon drove home by way of the gas station, where he stopped for a cup of coffee from the machine. He sat in the parking lot and thought about what Lottie had asked. The next day, he went to see his neighbor Estelle Dye, who was 78 and had lived his whole life on the same farm on Big Sinking Creek. Estelle had a long memory and no particular reason to protect anybody. Vernon asked him what he knew about the Skaggs boarding house up the hollow. Estelle was on his porch when Vernon pulled up, sitting in a cane rocker with a quilted blanket over his legs, watching his dog root around in the dry leaves at the edge of the yard. He was a bony man with a face like weathered fence post, a hearing aid that he adjusted constantly, and a habit of looking just past your left shoulder when he talked to you. He was quiet for a good while after Vernon asked the question. "Folks knew about that place," Estelle said finally. "Those old boys that stayed there, everybody knew they didn't have people. That was how she picked them. Somebody with family nearby, family would come asking. Somebody alone, nobody came." He adjusted his hearing aid. Her husband was a deacon at First Baptist. Son Earl was on the school board. You didn't cross that family back then. And those old men, he shook his head. They didn't have anybody to speak for them. So nobody said anything. Did people know she was taking their money? Estelle looked at his dog. People suspected something wasn't right, but suspecting and saying so are 2 different things in a small county. He looked back at Vernon, or just past him. "You got proof?" "I got her own ledger," Vernon said. Estelle was quiet a moment. "Then you got more than anybody had before." He pulled the blanket up his lap. "Earl Skaggs sits on the county magistrate bench now, just so you know what you're walking into." Vernon thanked him and drove home. The sky had gone flat and gray, and the wind was picking up from the northwest. He turned the heater up in the truck and thought about power of attorney forms and ledger books and what happens when a community decides, together, silently, to look the other way. The Carter County District Attorney's Office occupied the 2nd floor of a building on Court Street in Grayson that also housed a title company and an insurance agent. Vernon went on a Thursday morning, the documents in a box this time, a shirt box from a department store, the kind with a lid. He'd written a summary on a yellow legal pad of who the victims were, what the documents showed, and what the property records confirmed. He'd spent 2 evenings on the summary, writing slowly, choosing words carefully. The assistant DA was a young man named Wells, early 30s, dark suit, a tie with a small pattern on it, the kind of shoes you'd see in a city. He had a Carter County accent under the lawyer speech, which meant he'd come from here and gone away for school and come back. Vernon had seen that story before. Sometimes it turned out well. Wells read the summary while Vernon sat across the desk and watched him. He read it twice. Then he opened the shirt box and went through the documents. Not all of them, but enough. The power of attorney forms, the composition notebook, the death certificates. He looked at the property records printouts from Paulette at the courthouse. "Mr. Tackett," he said, setting the last document down. "These papers describe what looks like a sustained criminal scheme. Fraudulently obtaining power of attorney. Forging endorsements on pension checks, that's mail fraud, potentially, given the Veterans Administration checks came through the mail. Filing false death certificates to eliminate next of kin. This is not a small thing. Vernon waited. Wells opened a desk drawer and took out a reference book, looked something up. His expression shifted, not dramatically, just a settling around the eyes, like a window closing. These events took place between 1954 and 1968. That's right. The statute of limitations for fraud in Kentucky is 5 years. For theft, 5 years. For forgery, 5 years. He set the book down. The criminal window on all of this closed by 1973 at the latest. 50 years ago. Vernon had known it was coming. He'd thought about it on the drive over. It still felt like a punch in the chest. So there's nothing you can do. Criminally, no. The law is clear on this. I can't prosecute acts that are 5 decades outside the statute. He leaned back in his chair. That said, the property situation is different. That's a civil matter. The families of the victims could potentially file suit to recover property that was obtained through fraud. Property transfers accomplished through fraudulent means can sometimes be voided regardless of how much time has passed, depending on when the fraud was discovered. You're saying they'd have to sue her. Sue the estate, potentially. Or Lorena Skaggs directly while she's still alive. It would be a civil action in circuit court. He paused. And they'd need an attorney willing to take it, and they'd be suing a family with long-standing connections in this county. He looked at Vernon steadily. Her son sits on the magistrate bench. Vernon picked up his hat from his knee, turned it in his hands. You're saying it can be done, but nobody's going to rush to help them do it. I'm saying the legal avenue exists. I'm not in a position to tell you it will be easy. Vernon drove home feeling the familiar hollow feeling. The feeling he got when he understood that the system was not indifferent, exactly, just shaped in a certain way, and the shape happened to protect the people who'd been shaping it for decades. He was sitting on the porch with his second coffee when the Ford Lincoln Town Car turned in off the county road and came slowly up his gravel drive. It was a black town car, maybe 10 years old, kept clean. The woman who got out of it was small, 5'2" at most, and impeccably dressed in a dark blue wool coat with a white scarf at the collar. White hair pinned in a neat bun, small pearl earrings. She carried a black purse over one arm, the kind with a rigid frame, the kind Vernon's grandmother had carried to church. She walked toward him with the careful, deliberate step of a person who has never in her life moved without thinking about how she appeared. Vernon set his coffee down on the porch railing and stood up. "Mr. Tackett," she said, when she reached the foot of the porch steps. Her voice was light and measured, a good church voice. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." "You're not," Vernon said. "I'm Lorena Skaggs," she said. "I believe we have something to discuss." She did not ask to come up. She stood at the foot of the steps with her purse over her arm and looked up at him pleasantly, and Vernon noticed that her eyes were very pale blue, almost gray, and that they did not match the pleasantness of the rest of her face. "I heard you've been asking about my old boarding house," she said. "And I heard you picked up some furniture from a house on Pruitt Hollow." "I did," Vernon said. "I believe the Singer sewing machine in that house may have belonged to my mother originally. It has sentimental value to my family." She opened her purse and took out an envelope, the kind that held cash. "I'd like to buy it back from you. I'd be willing to offer $500. Vernon looked at the envelope. A Singer cabinet model in that condition was worth $80 on a good day at the flea market. "That machine's not for sale," he said. Something moved in her pale eyes. It was brief, a flash of something cold and assessing, the way a card player's face changes for just a moment when the hand doesn't come out the way they expected. Then the pleasantness came back. "Well," she said, "think about it. $500 is a fair price for sentiment." She put the envelope back in her purse. "You know how it is with old things. They have value beyond what they're worth." "I know," Vernon said. She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned and walked back to her car with the same careful, deliberate step. She backed out of the driveway without hurrying and turned south on the county road. Vernon sat back down and picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He sat there thinking about Lorena Skaggs's pale eyes and the $500 envelope and the careful pleasantness that sat over her like a coat over something else entirely. She hadn't asked what was in the drawer. She already knew. She'd known from the moment Buddycraft called him to come take the furniture. She'd been waiting to see what he would do, and now she knew that too. Vernon's wife Darlene came to the screen door and looked out. Who was that? Woman who used to run a boarding house, Vernon said. Darlene looked at the driveway where the town car had been. She wants something? Tried to buy the singer. What'd you tell her? No. Darlene looked at him a moment. She had known him for 38 years, and she understood when a thing was bigger than it sounded. You want me to call Pastor Combs and tell him we won't be at the potluck Friday? That might be a good idea, Vernon said. She went back inside without another word. That was Darlene. She didn't need the whole story to know the shape of it. The call from Earl Skaggs came 2 days after his mother's visit, on a Saturday morning when Vernon was sorting boxes of glassware in the barn. Vernon heard the phone ring in the house, then heard Darlene say his name from the back door. Earl Skaggs was a man who used courtesy the way some men use a firearm, as a way of making clear what would happen if you didn't comply. His voice on the phone was measured, almost gentle. Mr. Tackett, I appreciate you taking my call. Sure, Vernon said. I understand you've been doing some research into my mother's boarding house, and I understand she visited you this week. A pause. I want you to understand my family's position. My mother is 81 years old. She ran that boarding house for 30 years as a service to elderly men who had nobody else. She gave them rooms and meals and companionship when their own families had forgotten them. What you have in your possession are old business records, and I'd ask you to think carefully about what you're doing with them. Vernon listened. He stood at the kitchen counter, his barn gloves still on, leaving prints on the receiver. Those men had families, Vernon said. A brief pause. Those men were cared for by my mother when their families were nowhere to be found. Now, 60 years later, someone is trying to manufacture a controversy out of old paperwork. I'd ask you to consider what that accomplishes and who it hurts. It might accomplish getting some stolen property back to the people it belonged to, Vernon said. The measured courtesy stayed in place, but something under it went tight. I'd encourage you to talk to an attorney before you make any accusations you can't support, Earl Skaggs said. And I'd remind you that Carter County is a small place, Mr. Tackett. People know each other here. Vernon said goodbye and hung up. He drove to Lottie's house that afternoon and told her about the DA's office and Lorena's visit and Earl's call. Lottie listened sitting at her kitchen table with her arthritic hands folded in front of her, not moving, her face still. When he finished, she said, "So nobody's going to do anything?" "Not the DA. Statute ran out before any of us was paying attention. And a civil suit." She stopped. "Civil suit is possible," Vernon said, "but it means finding a lawyer willing to go up against Earl Skaggs's family in Carter County. And it means you'd have standing to sue, being Emmett's nearest surviving family." Lottie was quiet. She looked at the window, which showed the side yard and the bare vegetable garden. "I can't afford a lawyer, Vernon." "I know. And even if I could—" She stopped again. This time she didn't finish the sentence, but Vernon finished it in his head. "Every judge in this county knows Earl Skaggs." They sat for a while in the quiet kitchen. The beans from Wednesday were gone, replaced now by the smell of coffee grounds in the trash. The framed photograph of Harold on the windowsill watched them both. It was Lottie who spoke first. "Emmett didn't have anyone when he was in that house. He had me, in theory, but I was just a girl and I didn't know. Nobody knew." She looked at her folded hands. "He doesn't have to not have anyone now." Vernon drove home and called his cousin Harold in Ashland. This time Harold answered. Harold had a clerk's mind and 30 years of courthouse experience spread across 3 counties. He knew who owed favors to whom and who operated outside those arrangements. "You're looking for somebody who does property law, takes contingency cases, and doesn't have anything to lose in Carter County, Harold said, when Vernon laid it out. That's about right. Harold thought for a moment. Burl Combs. He's semi-retired, got an office above the hardware store on Carter Avenue in Ashland. He's 70, maybe 71. Practiced property and estate law his whole career. His wife died 3 years back, and his kids are in Columbus. He's got nothing tying him to Carter County politics, and he's been known to take cases that he thinks are right, even when they're not easy. A pause. He's stubborn as a fence post, and he'll tell you exactly what he thinks, whether you want to hear it or not. That's what I need, Vernon said. Vernon drove to Ashland the next morning, with the documents in the shirt box in the passenger seat. 45 minutes east on 23 to the river, then north into town. He found the hardware store on Carter Avenue, found the staircase on the side of the building, climbed to the second floor. Burl Combs had a face like a former boxer, heavy through the jaw, the nose broken at least once, and set a little off-center. He wore a button-down shirt with no tie, reading glasses on a chain around his neck. His desk was covered in files, stacked in precise columns that suggested he knew where everything was. A framed photograph on the bookshelf showed a woman with gray hair, smiling. He read every page of the documents while Vernon sat across the desk and waited. He did not hurry, and he did not speak. He read the power of attorney forms, the ledger, the death certificates, the property record copies. He held the composition notebook under the desk lamp and read it line by line. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Vernon over the reading glasses. This woman ran a confidence scheme, he said. She identified elderly men with income, no family proximity, and no one to advocate for them. She obtained legal control of their finances under false pretenses, extracted their benefits for years, and when they died, she filed their death certificates falsely to eliminate any challenge to inheriting their property. He set the glasses down. The criminal statute is gone, but the property is still there, and Kentucky law provides that the statute of limitations for a fraud claim does not begin to run until the fraud is discovered. These documents were in that Singer drawer until 3 weeks ago. The fraud was concealed, actively concealed, by false death certificates and false claims of no next of kin. You can make a reasonable argument that the clock started the day you opened that drawer. Vernon leaned forward. So the suit is possible. It's possible. It's not simple. I'd want more plaintiffs. The more families we can identify, the harder it is for the defense to argue this was a misunderstanding. A pattern across 6 victims is harder to dismiss than one claim. He picked up a yellow legal pad and a pen. What family does each victim have? Emmett Prater has a niece. The others, I don't know yet. Then we find out. Burl wrote the names down from the documents Vernon had provided. You bring me the families. I'll file in Boyd County Circuit Court, not Carter County, not anywhere Earl Skaggs has an easy reach. And I'll take this on contingency. My fee comes from the property recovery, not from your pockets. Vernon looked at the man. You've seen this kind of thing before? I've seen the shape of it, Burl said. People with a little power and a little patience picking off people who can't fight back. It happens in small counties more than most people want to admit. He capped his pen. The difference this time is somebody opened a drawer and had enough sense to know what he was looking at. He stopped at Lottie's on the way back. She listened, her hands folded, her face still. When he finished, she said, Burl Combs. She tried the name out. Is he a good man? Harold says he's stubborn and honest. That'll do, Lottie said. Finding the families took 3 weeks. Vernon and Lottie divided the names and worked the way you work in a small state where everyone is connected through church and kin and county fairs. You asked people you knew, who asked people they knew, and you followed the thread. Walter Hensley's family was easiest. A man named Gary Hensley ran a garage in Moorhead, 40 miles west, and he was Walter's grandson. He came into the picture cautiously at first. A Sunday afternoon phone call where he said mostly, yeah, and uh-huh, and I'll have to think about it. until Vernon drove over and spread the documents on the kitchen table of the garage office, and Gary looked at the ledger page with his grandfather's name at the top and the column of dollar amounts going down the left side, and then at the property record showing Walter Hensley's land on Little Fork Creek transferring to Lorena Skaggs in 1965. Gary Hensley had a habit of pulling at his left ear when he was thinking. He pulled it for a long time. "My grandmother always said Granddad sent her money when he could," he said finally. "But she never got anything after 62 or so. We figured he spent it." He looked at the ledger. Somebody spent it all right. Cecil Booth's family was harder to find. The name was common enough in eastern Kentucky that it took Lottie 3 phone calls and a visit to a church in Greenup County before she found a woman named Marvella Booth Stacy, who was Cecil's great-niece. Marvella was 62, sharp, with close-cropped hair the color of iron, and a way of finishing sentences before you finished them. She had a letter from Cecil, written in January of 1966, mailed from Carter County, that said a woman was taking care of his money. He seemed to think that was a good arrangement. The letter was the last one Marvella's family ever received from him. She drove to Grayson to read the documents herself. She didn't pull at her ear. She read everything in silence, set it down, and said, "What do we need to do?" Robert Dillon's nephew was a man named Parks Dillon, who lived in Louisa and worked at a hardware store. He'd been paying county property taxes on a small parcel near the Elliott County line for years, 8 acres that had passed to him from his father, who'd gotten it from Robert's brother. He had never known that Robert had once owned the 40 acres adjacent to his 8. 40 good acres that now showed in the county records as part of the Skaggs family holdings. When Vernon showed him the property records, Parks Dillon stood at his kitchen counter for a long time without moving. His wife, a woman named Teresa with reading glasses on a beaded chain like Burl Combs's, stood next to him and looked at the same records. She was the one who spoke first. "How do we file?" Teresa Dillon said. She took the reading glasses off and looked at Vernon directly. "Tell me who we call, and I'll make the call tonight." That was the women's moment, Vernon thought later. Teresa Dillon, who had no legal connection to any of this, who had married into a family that had been cheated before she was born, who made the call that joined the case. Burl Combs filed the civil suit in Boyd County Circuit Court on a Wednesday morning in December. The complaint named Lorena May Skaggs and her estate, seeking the return of all real property obtained through fraudulent power of attorney from 6 identified elderly victims between 1954 and 1968. The plaintiffs were Lottie Prater for Emmett Prater, Gary Hensley for Walter Hensley, Marvella Booth Stacy for Cecil Booth, and Parks Dillon for Robert Dillon. The exhibit list filled 4 pages. The original documents from the Singer drawer were item number 1. Earl Skaggs held a press conference on the Carter County Courthouse steps 2 days after the filing. Vernon heard about it from Harold. Earl stood at the top of the steps in a good overcoat and told a reporter from the Grayson newspaper that the lawsuit was an attack on a beloved elderly widow by people who had found some old business records and were trying to manufacture a financial claim 60 years after the fact. He called it shameful. He called it opportunistic. He said his mother had spent her life serving the community. The Grayson newspaper ran the story on page 3. Lorena's attorney, a man from Lexington named Hargis, the kind of attorney who wore a signet ring and a suit that cost more than Vernon made in a month, filed a motion to dismiss on grounds that the claims were time-barred by the statute of limitations. The motion was carefully written and cited 7 cases. Vernon read it sitting at Burl's desk in Ashland, while Burl read it again, making notes in the margins with a red pen. "He's right that the statute is an issue," Burl said. "He's wrong that it kills the case." He flipped to the last page. Kentucky Revised Statute, Chapter 413, Section 10. The statute of limitations on a fraud claim does not begin to run until the defrauded party discovers, or reasonably should have discovered, the fraud. He set the motion down. These documents were in a sewing machine drawer in a condemned house. Nobody could have discovered them without opening the drawer. The drawer was opened 3 weeks ago. The clock started 3 weeks ago. The judge in Boyd County was a woman named Abner, Judge Patricia Abner, 15 years on the bench with a reputation for reading every word in front of her and a known distaste for being told the answer before she'd worked the problem herself. She read the motion and Burrell's response over 2 weeks. Then she issued a 4-page ruling denying the motion to dismiss. The case would proceed. Earl Skaggs was not quoted in the paper about the ruling. Lorena Skaggs's deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in January at Hargis's office in Grayson. Vernon drove up from Cane Branch Road early, picked up Lottie, and they drove together in a Chevy through a hard gray morning. The sky threatening snow, the roads empty. Lorena arrived with Hargis in a dark car. She wore a blue wool dress and a pearl brooch, her white hair in the familiar neat bun. She walked into the conference room with the same careful, deliberate step Vernon had seen in his driveway. She sat down across the table from Burrell and folded her hands on the table, precisely, the fingers laced together, and looked at him with the pale blue eyes that did not match her calm face. Burrell went through the documents methodically, the way Vernon sorted stock at the flea market, by category, by date, by value. He placed the composition notebook in front of her. "Can you identify the handwriting in this document?" Lorena looked at the notebook for a moment. "That appears to be my handwriting," she said. Her voice was measured, composed. "Can you explain the column labeled net gain beside each boarder's name?" A brief pause. "Those were my household accounts." "You tracked what you profited from each resident's pension checks?" "I tracked my household income, as any responsible person would do." Burrell placed the death certificates in front of her. He placed them side by side, 6 white rectangles, the family sections all visible. All reading, "No next of kin." "Mrs. Skaggs, did you know that Emmett Ray Prater had a sister named Vivian Prater and a niece named Lottie Prater living in Carter County at the time of his death?" Something happened in Lorena's composure. Not much, not visible exactly, but Vernon, watching from the side of the room, saw it. A very slight compression of the lips, a tightening of the folded hands, there and gone in a half-second. "I was not aware of all the personal histories of my boarders," she said. "His niece Lottie is sitting in this room," Burrell said. "She was living 20 miles from your boarding house while her uncle was in your care and while you filed this death certificate stating he had no next of kin." Hargis put his hand on Lorena's arm. "My client would like to take a break," he said. They took a 15-minute break. When they came back, Hargis asked Burrell if he would be willing to discuss settlement terms. Burrell looked at him. "We want the land," he said. "All of it. Every parcel that transferred from a victim to your client. We want the land returned to the families. Cash payment won't settle this." Hargis said he would need time to confer with his client. Vernon drove home that evening through the hollows with the windows cracked, the cold air coming in, the bare trees on the ridges black against the last light in the sky. He did not feel triumph. He was too tired for triumph. But the case was built, the evidence was on the table, and Lorena Skaggs had sat across from her own handwriting and could not explain it away. He thought about 6 old men and 60 years of silence. He thought about a purple heart wrapped in flannel at the bottom of a drawer. The machine was turning. Whatever came next, the machine was turning. The Skaggs family's attorney asked for a week. He got 10 days, which was more than Burrell was willing to give, but less than he'd been asked for. On a Monday morning in the first week of February, Hargis called Burrell's office and said the family was prepared to discuss terms of property return. The negotiation took 3 more weeks. Burrell drove to Grayson twice. Vernon drove up once, sat in the hallway outside the conference room at Hargis's building, and read a 3-year-old Field and Stream from a stack of magazines on a side table. He did not go into the room. Burrell told him to stay out of the room. "You'll want to say something," Burrell said, "and if you say something, they'll use it." The settlement was signed in Boyd County Courthouse on a gray December morning that smelled of old carpet and radiator heat. Judge Abner read it into the record without editorial comment, which was her way. Lorena Skaggs did not appear. Hargis filed the documents on her behalf. He wore the signet ring. He kept his face professionally blank throughout. The terms: Emmett Ray Prater's 2 acres on Stinson Branch, with whatever remained of the original structure, would transfer to Lottie Prater within 30 days. Walter Hensley's land on Little Fork Creek would transfer to Gary Hensley. Cecil Booth's lot in Olive Hill would transfer to Marvella Booth Stacy. Robert Dillon's 40 acres near the Elliott County line would transfer to Parks Dillon. 2 additional parcels, belonging to Thomas Aldridge Goins and August Franklin Sloan, whose family's Burroughs investigators had been unable to locate, would be placed in a trust administered by Boyd County for local community purposes. Lorena Skaggs's house in Olive Hill, the large house she had built and maintained on profits from 14 years of systematic exploitation, would be sold. The proceeds would be distributed among the 4 plaintiff families to cover the value of any remaining claims. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing. Hargis had made that non-negotiable, and Burrell had agreed to it because what mattered was the land, not the confession. The land transfers were recorded by the end of the week. Burrell called Vernon on a Friday afternoon to tell him. "That's all of them?" Vernon asked. "All 4. The county trust paperwork will take another month, but the concept is in place." A pause. Earl Skaggs submitted his resignation from the magistrate bench this morning. He cited family health concerns. Vernon was quiet. "Burrell," he said. "Yeah, you said this was the first time the law did what it was supposed to do." "I said that. I stand by it." "I'm not sure I agree with you." A long pause. "No," Burrell said. "I don't suppose justice arriving 60 years late qualifies as working right. But it arrived. That's not nothing." Vernon thanked him and hung up. The story moved through Carter County the way all stories move through small places, in pieces, at kitchen tables, at the feed store on Saturday morning, in the parking lot after church. Some people were horrified. An older woman who had known Lorena from the women's circle at First Baptist said she always thought there was something not right about how those old men came and went. A man at the flea market in Grayson told Vernon he was a troublemaker stirring up things that were better left alone. Vernon sold him a set of canning jars for $8 and did not argue. Estill Dye drove over to Vernon's place on a cold afternoon in February, pulling his old GMC carefully along the gravel. He got out, moving stiffly. The hip had been bothering him since November, and came up on the porch and sat in the extra chair. Vernon poured him coffee. "Earl resigned," Estill said. "I heard." "You know what that is, in Carter County terms?" Estill wrapped his hands around the mug. He had large hands, knotted at the knuckles, the hands of a man who had farmed his whole life. "That's about the loudest thing that family could say without saying anything. There won't be a trial. There won't be anything in writing. But every person in this county who has any sense now knows what that family did." Vernon nodded. "Those old boys," Estill said. He looked out at the field. "They deserved better while they were living, but at least somebody said so." He drove home an hour later, taking the gravel slow. Vernon watched until the GMC's taillights disappeared around the curve. He kept the Singer sewing machine. It sat in the living room against the north wall, near the window. Darlene dusted around it and occasionally mentioned that they could get $200 for it at the flea market, given the cabinet condition. Vernon said each time that he wasn't ready to sell it. She knew better than to push, which was one of the better qualities in their marriage. He could not quite explain what he meant by not ready. The machine was not his to sell. That was what he said, though the legal title had passed to him when he bought the furniture from the salvage job. But it felt true in some other sense he couldn't find language for. The machine had held the secret for 60 years. Somebody should hold it a while longer, with the knowledge of what it held. Or maybe he just wasn't ready to be done with it. Maybe that was all it was. Burl Combs took his contingency fee in the form of a small portion of the Hensley property, a creek bottom piece, about 3 acres, with a stand of old sycamores along the water. He turned around and donated it to the Greenup County Historical Society, which planned to use it as a natural area. He told Vernon about it over the phone in a tone that suggested he found it slightly amusing. "45 years of practicing law," he said. "This is the first case where I didn't feel like I needed to apologize to anyone for how it came out." Vernon said he thought that was something. "It is," Burl said. "It doesn't happen as often as you'd think." Earl Skaggs did not run for re-election in the spring. His name appeared in the Grayson paper once more, in a brief note announcing he had moved his household to Boyd County to be closer to family. His mother, Lorena, moved in with him when the Olive Hill house was sold. The settlement included no admission of wrongdoing. The property transfers spoke for themselves. In Carter County, the names on 6 death certificates were amended by court order to reflect the actual next of kin. For the first time in 60 years, the official record told the truth about who these men had been and who had loved them. Epilogue. The Boyd County judge signed the final property transfer orders on a Tuesday in January. Cold morning, streets icy. Lorena Skaggs did not appear. Her attorney filed the documents on her behalf. Judge Abner read the settlement into the record in a level voice. When she reached the end, she set the papers down. "This court cannot undo 60 years of harm," she said, "but it can return what was taken and correct the record that was falsified. That is all the law allows." He signed the orders. The hearing was over in 11 minutes. Lottie Prater drove to the 2 acres on Stinson Branch on the first warm day in March. The land was overgrown. Honeysuckle and blackberry vines had taken the yard, the foundation of Emmett's house barely visible beneath the growth. 4 low stone courses with a gap where the door had been. She walked the property line with the deed in her jacket pocket. She did not plan to build. She did not plan to sell. She cleared a small patch near the foundation and planted a dogwood sapling she'd wrapped in burlap in the back of her Jeep Cherokee. Emmett's Purple Heart went into a shadow box that same weekend, hung on the living room wall beside a photograph from her mother's cedar chest. Emmett in his uniform, 1943, young, unbroken. Lottie said his name aloud, once. She had not done that in 40 years. She called Vernon that evening and said, "I wish he knew somebody cared enough to look." Vernon didn't answer right away. He was standing in his living room, looking at the singer against the north wall. "He would have known," Vernon said finally, though he wasn't sure it was true. "Some things you said because they needed saying, not because you could prove them." Vernon Tackett drove his Chevy up Pruitt Hollow one more time in late March, when the buds on the oaks were days from opening. The condemned house was gone. The bulldozer had come and gone in January, leaving a flat patch of red clay where the building had stood. The gravel patch where he'd parked that November morning was still there, and he pulled in and cut the engine. He got out and stood with his hands in the pockets of his canvas jacket, looking at the patch of red clay and the creek below the road and the bare ridgeline against the pale March sky. The hollow was quiet, just the creek running over rocks. He took one hand from his pocket and touched the brim of his cap. A small, slow gesture, almost a salute. Then he turned, climbed back into the truck, and drove down the hollow toward the county road. The creek ran alongside him all the way out, the way it always had, the way it always would.